my name is Dr. Shairi Turner. I'm an internist and a pediatrician. I am a medical consultant for the Florida Department of Health, and I was the Chief Medical Director for the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice.
Cool. So lots of cool things. So to start off, we're just going to do a brief overview of your definition of what sexual abuse is.
Okay, so sexual abuse has a lot of different definitions depending on where you're looking.
Did you say it too soon? Get your paper wrinkled. So we need
Oh, you can hear that? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry.
So to start things off, could you give us a brief kind of overview?
So the definition of sexual abuse, depending on where you look, can be very broad or very specific. For example, the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women defines sexual assault as any sexual contact or behavior that occurs without the explicit consent of the recipient. So you have the explicit consent, meaning either the person cannot or does not give consent for the sexual activity.
Cool. Could you kind of explain a little bit of...
Leave a little more edit room, like give like 5 seconds after she says, so that way, or like even 2 or 3, but you're cutting like right away, so it'd be very difficult to edit.
Sure.
Sorry.
No, you're...
Sorry, I'm being nitpicky.
Yeah, you're fine. Okay, so that's like kind of the explicit zone of how things interact, but in a more personal level, what are some signs that parents can kind of look for to see that this is going on, and maybe give an example or two of that?
Okay, so some examples that parents can look for. Obviously, any physical signs. And then it really depends on the child's age. So younger children, you may have regression of behaviors. So children who were once potty trained, suddenly needing diapers, or children who had slept through the night, suddenly having nocturnal enuresis or bedwetting. As a child gets older, there's always the issue with behaviors. So children who are becoming more frightened, acting out, aggressive, angry, sad. It's really about knowing the child and looking for those changes in behavior. As children get older, you can see, again, issues with school performance, eating disorders, children who have otherwise doing well in the home environment suddenly becoming afraid or fear of a particular caregiver or particular place suddenly. So it's about knowing the child and seeing some of the changes. With sexual abuse, oftentimes the perpetrator gets to know the child and can look for things that when the child is particularly vulnerable. So you wanted examples on what parents, I mean that's specifically some of the things they can look for. And then also children, teenagers who start to act out sexually can either have hypersexualization or sexual promiscuity, where that wasn't always the situation. Those are things. And then depression, anxiety, newly emerging mental health disorders can oftentimes be a sign. Overeating or anorexia as well. Those are all these changes in behavior that tell you on the outside that something is wrong inside.
Okay, cool. So it's kind of just this process of knowing the specific person and kind of seeing something's wrong and being like, okay, this isn't normal, and kind of addressing that and seeing the root of that problem. Do you have any steps that you could prevent this from happening, or almost addressing it when it is happening?
So it's very important to be aware and to be watching the child. So who is
I don't mean
the
to interrupt you, but can you say that again and say like the steps that you could do is to kind of...
So the steps to prevent this from happening?
Yeah.
Okay. Some of the steps that can be used to prevent this from happening, obviously.
Can we? Yeah.
Sorry.
Noise.
Sorry.
Do you need to get through?
No, I'm kidding.
That's fine.
Okay. Blooper reel.
Okay.
Definitely.
So some of the steps.
Here, sorry.
Right,
Give it like a
give
little
it like
bit.
a second.
I'm not sure if he's gonna.
Yeah.
You're doing great though.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Do you want like a water or anything? I can get you something.
Sure. I can need it
I'll
right
be right back. Don't worry, I won't walk in, right?
Right.
So how long have you been studying this kind of?
Let's see. I've been doing this probably for the past, on and off for the past 15 years or so. I did a postdoctoral research fellowship at Harvard School of Public Health.
Oh, cool.
And that's where I had started with trauma. And then when I came down here in 2005 to be the chief medical director, I mean, all of the kids who are involved in juvenile justice have some sort of trauma history.
Right.
So it really kind of took off from then.
That's awesome. It's really cool to see people doing that.
Yeah.
Do you think we're good?
Well, she may come back, but given, I guess she would just kind of hang out.
Yeah,
So.
she'll
Okay.
hear us talking.
Yeah, cool. All right, so we'll restart the question, and then
Yes.
just remember to take like a 2-second pause before.
All right, so kind of addressing the steps that parents or guardians can take to prevent this from happening.
So parents or guardians can prevent or try to prevent sexual abuse by just being aware of where their child is, who is taking care of their child. Oftentimes, only 10% of sexual abuse occurs by a stranger. So many people think, keep my children from strangers and they'll be safe from sexual abuse. But that means that 90% of the perpetrators are known to the children. So it's, who's taking care, who's the babysitter, who's the relative, where is your child? So if your child is with some friends, know that they're then with the friends of the friends too. So it's important to focus on who is my child around, but you don't want to create a fear amongst, a fear for the child. So it's really important about empowering children to speak about things that happen. It's important to be very clear about having the child tell the parent if someone is not treating them appropriately. It's important to use specific and appropriate language for body parts. So as children learn all body parts, they should learn their private parts with the correct terminology. Parents should talk to their children about who can and cannot and who should and should not touch you in your private areas. So that way a parent opens a dialogue so that the children know to come back if something has happened. If someone makes you feel uncomfortable, come tell me. If someone touches you in an inappropriate place, come tell me. So you create a line of communication with the child to keep that kind of secrecy piece from taking over.
All right, cool. So it seems like communication is like the main theme in keeping this out in the light. And with Lauren specifically, the perpetrator was a very close person in her life, which is a very common theme. So what is a common way for people to take time to get over this? And almost after they've spoken about it, what are the steps that they can take to then address it and get past that and have a very successful and healthy life? Okay.
So ways to deal with and get past sexual abuse is, number one, acknowledging that it happened. So the critical piece is for there to be an awareness, for the person to have spoken to someone, the child to speak to an adult, to be received and believed is very important. To then recognize that the experience never goes away, right? So you heal through bringing it into the light, making people aware, going to see a therapist who understands sexual abuse. All of those things allow the healing to begin. One of the other critical pieces is to make sure that the child or adult realizes that it was not their fault, that it is not something that they caused to happen, but something that happened to them, so that they then realize that there was nothing that I did to deserve this. And then once you get to that point, it's about recognizing triggers. So a person, a place, a thing may trigger an individual to remember and recall that abuse. And how then, what are the tools we can give to individuals, adults, and children who've experienced sexual abuse so that when those triggers happen, one, you recognize that they're going to happen, and then two, what do you do when you're triggered? Recognizing that you're not back in that very vulnerable situation, but you're here real time. What are the tools that one can use to continue to be productive and be okay in a situation.
Cool, that was a really good answer. So next we're going to move on a little bit to why it would be so difficult for a child to talk to their closest parents and guardians when something like this happens.
So for children, it's challenging sometimes to bring sexual abuse to an adult, to a parent or a guardian, for several reasons. Fear, shame, embarrassment. If they're afraid that they won't be believed, if they are thinking that the parent will be angry. Sometimes the perpetrator will threaten the child or the parent if the child reports. Embarrassment. The thought that this was someone who was here to care for me, for instance, is now sexually abusing me, creates a lot of confusion for children. So again, it goes back to that open communication between children and parents, so that children feel like no matter what happens, my parents will always hear me and will support me. It then explains why many children, not all, but many children who are sexually abused don't have that good parental support or network where the perpetrator is aware that the child is vulnerable in that way, doesn't have that social support system. So it makes it easier to kind of create a relationship with a child. It's called grooming, creating that relationship with a child so that they're suddenly in the midst of someone who they thought was safe, but that person is then touching them inappropriately or engaging in inappropriate sexual behavior with them.
Cool. And
if I don't answer it fully, like, feel free.
No, you're actually covering like multiple questions with this, so I'm like skipping down.
Okay.
You're doing great.
Yeah.
Okay, so it is clear that this instance and all of these things that happen are very traumatic towards people who experience sexual abuse. Could you maybe talk about how this can create a stronger character for them and build them up and make them a stronger person from this trauma?
Okay, so how can trauma make someone stronger or build character? Well, character building is when something occurs, either positive or negative, and we turn it into something that makes us stronger. So when someone has experienced sexual abuse, again, very important that they acknowledge that they're not alone, right? So understanding that many people, the prevalence and the incidence of trauma and sexual abuse, still very much underreported, but quite prevalent. So it's understanding, it's sorry.
Very good.
Can you repeat the question one more time?
Yeah, it's just how someone overcoming these things can build stronger character and kind of take it as an advantage in the long run.
Okay. So it's taking that experience that many people feel and view as negative and doing something productive with it. So in Lauren Book's case, she's created a movement around her negative experience. So that becomes hugely empowering. It puts a voice and a face to the experience. Again, it takes it out of that darkness so that other children can look at her and say, hey, she has become productive. She is very successful. She is okay. And you become a role model then for other people who have experienced this, and they're more willing to talk about it, and they're more willing to seek help by doing it. So in that way, taking anything that's negative and turning it into something positive or something that makes you stronger as an individual or helps other people can always build character.
Cool. So we have a couple more. Okay, so Lauren's traveled around all the time campaigning for her organization and everything, and she's even done a TED Talk on it, and it's very inspiring. I watched it a couple days ago. So what's your personal opinion on a scholarly or personal level of Lauren's cause and the fact that she took this life and made it beneficial for so many other people?
All right, just a sec. We got Jenny coming back. She's in the
Sorry.
front, so.
Water break.
Yeah.
I'll take this sip.
Yeah, nice. And you can just put it on the sill because we can't see it.
Can't
so
see
you
it.
just, yeah.
All right.
Yeah, so we have like a couple more, so we're almost done.
Yeah. How are you doing? Do you need to run?
Well, if we're almost, I can stick around. But.
Okay.
Okay. So, Lauren Book's campaign has just been phenomenal because it again removes the darkness around sexual abuse. It makes people aware. It makes it okay to talk about sexual abuse. It makes people realize that there's a face and a voice. Oftentimes, parents or individuals want to say, well, this couldn't happen to my child. My child doesn't look like the children that I think would be sexually abused. So she puts a very positive light on talking about sexual abuse, on healing from sexual abuse. And that's just phenomenal. I mean, she's taken a life experience and turned it into a cause. She's turned it into a movement to support others and to keep this from happening to other children.
Perfect. So the last question, as a pediatrician, is there anything else you want people to know about sexual abuse or anything else on Lauren?
Absolutely. So as a pediatrician, I would say that sexual abuse, number one, is very prevalent. Number two, it happens to boys and girls. So we cannot forget that boys are experiencing this, that there's underreporting both for boys and girls, that the connection between physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and later health conditions and mental health conditions is well established. If people don't think that it can happen to their child, they need to have an awareness that it can, no matter what their socioeconomic status, race, it doesn't matter because sexual abuse is that prevalent. Again, that 10% of the perpetrators are strangers. So that means that 90% almost of the perpetrators are known to the children. They can be adults or other children. So they can be teenagers, they can be young adults. And that it's very important that people realize, 1 in 5 college girls are sexually assaulted, 1 in 16 college boys are sexually assaulted. So it's as a pediatrician, I would want people to know that sexual abuse happens, that it's very serious, that there are steps that they can take to protect their children. But the most important thing is empowering children around understanding and saying no, number one, and number two, being okay to tell your parent if something happens to you.
Perfect.
Yeah. If we could just clarify one thing, you mentioned there's health conditions
Yes.
that are
Yes.
more prevalent with people
who've experienced.
Yeah, so maybe
Okay.
if you can just kind of say that sentence again
Some
and be
of
like,
the
what?
health
Yeah, some of the health
conditions.
Okay.
conditions.
Some of the health conditions.
Yeah, you guys.
3, 2.
Some of the health conditions that have been associated with abuse and neglect, so physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect, obesity, heart disease, hypertension, some cancers, mental health conditions, depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, all of these things. It's the mind-body connection. So especially when you have children at those early developmental years who experience sexual abuse, the mental health conditions that follow, the physical health conditions we know are very significant. Lung disease, so COPD, liver disease, really related to how people self-medicate. So people who have untreated, unresolved trauma can find that they're self-medicating with alcohol, drugs, tobacco, and all of the sequelae from overuse of those substances can create health conditions.
Cool.